is a specific kind of exhaustion you see in certain men. Not the exhaustion that comes from hard work or physical strain, but something deeper, a heaviness in the eyes that suggests the man has been fighting a war he didn't know he was in, and losing ground every day without understanding why. You can see it in the way he sits, in the way he responds to simple questions with a half-second delay, as if he's constantly translating his own thoughts through a filter of what might be acceptable to say. These men often appear functional on the surface. They go to work, they maintain relationships, and they smile when expected to smile. But if you watch closely, you notice something crucial. They move through their own lives like tenants, not owners, like men waiting for permission to exist. I work with men who describe this feeling with remarkable consistency. They'll say things like, "I don't know when it happened, but somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling like myself." Or, "I keep doing what I think I'm supposed to do, but it never seems to be enough." What they're describing, though they rarely have the language for it, is a specific form of slow-motion dispossession. It doesn't happen in a single dramatic moment. It happens in 1,000 small negotiations, a compromise here, a silence there, a boundary dissolved, a plan abandoned. Each one seems reasonable in isolation. Each one feels like the mature, evolved thing to do, but taken together over months and years, they form a pattern of systematic self-abandonment that leaves a man unrecognizable to himself. The mechanism is invisible because it operates under the cover of virtue. He believes he's being loyal by staying. He believes he's being strong by enduring. He believes he's being loving by sacrificing. And all of these beliefs are reinforced by the language of modern relationships, which tells him that real men don't walk away, that commitment means weathering any storm, that if he just tries harder, communicates better, shows up more consistently, the dynamic will shift. So he stays. He invests more time, more energy, more of his diminishing emotional reserves. He stays through conversations that go nowhere, through patterns that repeat themselves with minor variations, through a feeling in his gut that something is fundamentally wrong but that he has no right to name. And every day he stays past the point when his instinct told him to leave. He pays a price. Not immediately, not obviously, but he pays. Niccolo Machiavelli understood power in a way that makes most people uncomfortable, because he refused to confuse what we wish were true with what actually is. He lived in Renaissance Italy, in a world of city-states and shifting alliances, where a ruler could lose everything overnight if he misread the nature of power or mistook goodwill for security. Machiavelli watched men fall not because they were cruel or incompetent, but because they were too patient, too trusting, too invested in appearing virtuous rather than being effective. He watched men wait too long to act on information they already had. He watched men ignore clear signals because acknowledging them would require difficult action. And he understood something essential, that in matters of power, and make no mistake, relationships are theaters of power. Timing is not incidental. Timing is everything. The man who acts when the moment demands it preserves his position. The man who hesitates, who stays too long hoping things will improve on their own, doesn't just fail to gain ground. He loses it, actively, measurably, and often irreversibly. The thesis that runs through everything Machiavelli wrote, and everything I'm about to show you, is this: a man who stays in a situation past the point of his own dignity teaches everyone around him, especially the woman he's staying for, exactly how little his dignity is worth. He believes his patience demonstrates strength. But patience without boundaries doesn't signal strength. It signals exploitability. And once a woman perceives a man as someone who will tolerate anything, who will stay regardless of how he's treated, who has nowhere else to go and nothing else to turn to, the entire foundation of attraction collapses, not because she's cruel, not because she wants to hurt him, but because human beings, and especially women in the context of mate selection, are biologically wired to assess resource value, boundary integrity, and optionality. A man who stays too long, who absorbs disrespect and continues to show up, who negotiates away his own standards piece by piece, is demonstrating in the most primal language possible that he has low mate value, and no amount of logical argument, no appeal to fairness or history or effort invested can override that perception once it's established. Let me show you how this actually unfolds. Consider a man in a relationship where the dynamic has shifted. Maybe she's become distant, maybe the intimacy has disappeared, maybe she's critical in ways that feel designed to diminish rather than improve him. Maybe she's still present physically, but absent in every way that matters. He notices this. He feels it, but he doesn't leave, because leaving would mean admitting failure, admitting he wasted time, admitting he made a mistake. So instead, he tries to fix it. He initiates more, he plans more dates. He asks what's wrong, he offers to change, he goes to therapy, he reads books on communication, he does everything the culture tells him a good partner should do, and with every attempt, with every question that receives a vague non-answer, with every initiative that lands flat, he's not building toward resolution. He's eroding his own position. Here's what he thinks is happening. He thinks he's demonstrating commitment, showing her that he's serious, that he's not going anywhere, that she can trust him to stay even when things are difficult. He believed this would eventually soften her, remind her of his value, and re-establish the connection they once had. Here's what is actually happening. He's teaching her that his attention is free, that his time has no competing demand, that his presence can be taken for granted because it will be offered regardless of how it's received. Every day he stays without reciprocation is a day he's training her to perceive him as a man without options, a man who has structured his entire life around her, a man who needs her more than she needs him. And the moment that asymmetry becomes clear, attraction dies, not slowly, instantly. She may not even be conscious of it. She may still say she cares about him, but the feeling beneath the words has already shifted. Where there was once respect and desire, there is now something closer to contempt mixed with guilt. Machiavelli wrote that it is better to be feared than loved if you cannot be both. But what he really meant was this: it is better to be respected than needed. The man who is needed becomes a utility. The man who is respected remains a person. And respect, in the economy of relationships, is earned not through grand gestures or emotional appeals, but through boundaries, through demonstrated optionality, through the quiet proof that you will walk away from situations that diminish you. The man who stays too long loses this proof. He becomes legible, predictable, safe in the worst sense of the word. And safety, when it comes at the expense of mystery and self-possession, is the death of desire. I once spoke to a man who stayed in a relationship for 2 years past the point where it had stopped functioning. He described those 2 years as a kind of emotional purgatory. Every conversation felt like an interrogation. Every attempt at intimacy was met with indifference or irritation. He stopped seeing his friends because she would get upset whenever he made plans that didn't include her, but she rarely wanted to do anything together. He stopped training, stopped working on the projects he cared about, because all his energy was consumed by trying to manage her moods and decode her signals. He kept thinking that if he could just figure out the right combination of words, the right timing, the right approach, things would return to how they were in the beginning. But they never did, and by the time he finally left, he had become unrecognizable. His friends barely knew him. His work had stagnated. His confidence was gone. He had spent 2 years trying to win back a woman who had already emotionally exited the relationship, and in the process, he had lost himself. Here's the detail most men miss. She didn't leave him because he stayed. She left him emotionally first, and eventually physically, because the man who stays too long becomes a different man. He becomes smaller, more anxious, more reactive. He starts monitoring her moods instead of living his own life. He starts editing his words, his plans, his desires to fit the narrow shape of what might not upset her. He starts negotiating with himself, abandoning small parts of his identity in a desperate attempt to reduce friction. And this process, this slow contraction of the self, is visible. She sees it. She may not be able to articulate it, but she feels it. And every time she sees him shrink, every time she watches him swallow his own boundary or apologize for something he didn't do wrong, her attraction dies a little more. Because attraction, for women, is not primarily about physical appearance or resources. It's about presence. It's about the feeling that this man exists independently of her, that he has a center of gravity she didn't create and cannot control. The man who stays too long loses that center. He becomes a satellite. And satellites are not attractive. Now zoom out. This pattern is not just an individual psychological failure. It's a response to a specific cultural and economic environment that has radically altered the landscape of male-female dynamics. We live in a world where attention is currency, where options are infinite, where the tools of mate selection, dating apps, social media, constant connectivity have created a marketplace that operates on hypergamist logic. Women, on average, have access to a vastly larger pool of potential partners than men do. The top 20% of men on dating platforms receive the majority of female attention. The bottom 80% are fighting for scraps, and most don't even know they're in that category until they've spent months or years exhausting themselves in a game they were never equipped to win. This creates a dynamic where the average man, when he does find a woman willing to invest in him, becomes terrified of losing her, because he knows, either consciously or unconsciously, that replacing her will be difficult, perhaps impossible. So when the relationship starts to sour, when the red flags appear, when his gut tells him to walk, he stays, because staying, no matter how painful, feels safer than the uncertainty of starting over. Machiavelli would recognize this immediately. He understood that fear makes men stupid. He understood that the man who acts out of scarcity will always make worse decisions than the man who acts out of abundance, not because abundance is morally superior, but because it allows for clarity. The man who believes he has no other options will tolerate anything. He will rationalize mistreatment. He will perform emotional labor that is never reciprocated. He will stay in situations that grind him down to nothing, because the alternative, being alone, starting over, facing the reality of a marketplace that doesn't favor him, feels unbearable. But here's the cost. Every day he stays in that dynamic, he becomes less attractive, less confident, less capable of attracting a better situation, even if he wanted to. His scarcity mindset becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. He stays because he's afraid he can't do better, and by staying, he ensures that he won't. The civilizational layer is darker still. We live in a period of profound confusion about what men are supposed to be. Traditional masculine virtues, agency, risk tolerance, boundary enforcement, the willingness to walk away from bad situations, are framed in public discourse as toxic. Men are told to be vulnerable, to communicate, to prioritize emotional availability above all else. And these are not bad things in themselves. But when they're presented as the totality of healthy masculinity, when men are told that strength is outdated and boundaries are aggression and walking away is abandonment, the result is a generation of men who have no framework for protecting themselves. They've been taught that the mature response to relationship dysfunction is to stay and work on it, that leaving is a failure, that endurance is love. And so, they endure. They endure disrespect, dead bedrooms, emotional manipulation, and contempt disguised as criticism. They endure because they believe endurance is a virtue, but endurance without reciprocity isn't virtue, it's self-destruction. If a system demands your vulnerability but offers no protection, staying in it isn't loyalty, it's learned helplessness. The man who stays too long in a relationship that has stopped serving him is participating in his own erasure. He's allowing someone else's indifference or contempt to define the terms of his existence. And the longer he stays, the more he internalizes the message that this is what he deserves, that this is the best he can do, that his job is to absorb whatever comes his way and be grateful for the opportunity. This is not love. This is not a partnership. This is a slow spiritual death dressed up in the language of commitment. She doesn't kill your purpose. She reflects its absence. This is the line men need to understand at the deepest possible level. When a woman loses respect for a man, it's rarely because of a single dramatic failure. It's because she sees day after day that he has made her the center of his life, that he has no mission beyond managing her emotions, that he has allowed the relationship to consume the parts of him that made him interesting in the first place. Women are attracted to men who are going somewhere, not men who need them, not men who have built their entire identity around being a good partner, but men who have a direction, a purpose, a life that exists independently and would continue to exist, whether she stays or leaves. The man who stays too long forfeits this. He sends a signal, louder than any words, that he has nowhere else to be, and that signal is repellent. So what does sovereignty look like in practice? How does a man who understands Machiavelli move differently? Start with this. Notice when you're negotiating with yourself. Notice when you're editing your desires, shrinking your boundaries, swallowing your instinct because you're afraid of the consequences of speaking or acting clearly. That moment of self-negotiation is the moment you start to lose. Sovereign men don't perform those internal gymnastics. They feel the instinct, they assess whether it's rooted in reality or fear, and then they act. If something feels wrong, they name it. If a boundary is crossed, they enforce it. If the cost of staying exceeds the value of the relationship, they leave. Not out of cruelty, not to punish, but because they understand that their dignity is not negotiable. Stop pretending patience is always a virtue. Patience with a woman who is genuinely working through something, who is reciprocating your investment, and who respects your time and energy is valuable. Patience with a woman who has checked out, who treats your presence as a given, who offers nothing but takes everything, is self-betrayal. Learn to distinguish between the two. Most men can feel the difference in their gut, but they ignore it because acknowledging it would require them to make a decision they're not ready to make. But that delay, that refusal to act on clear information, is what cost them everything. Machiavelli said that men should act while the iron is hot. That hesitation in the face of obvious reality is the beginning of ruin. He was right. The man who waits for the perfect moment, the perfect clarity, the perfect sign, will wait until he has nothing left to act with. Refuse to be the man who explains himself endlessly. If you find yourself constantly justifying your decisions, your feelings, your needs, you're already in a losing position. Explanation is fine when it's mutual, when both people are genuinely trying to understand each other. But when you're explaining and she's interrogating, when your words are being used against you, when nothing you say ever seems to be enough, stop. Not because communication is bad, but because you're not in a conversation. You're in a courtroom. And the longer you stay in that dynamic, the more you teach her that your reality is always up for debate, that your perspective is always suspect, that you could be worn down with enough pressure. Sovereign men don't live like that. They state their position once, maybe twice if there's genuine confusion, and then they allow the other person to react however they're going to react. They don't chase understanding. They don't beg to be heard. They speak clearly and then move accordingly. Allow her to react while you remain centered. This is perhaps the most difficult skill for men to learn because it requires you to stop managing her emotions. Most men, especially men who stay too long, have become experts in emotional management. They can feel her mood shift from across the room. They know exactly which topics to avoid, which words to use, and which tone will minimize conflict. They've built their entire relational strategy around keeping her comfortable, and in doing so, they've made themselves responsible for her internal state, which is both impossible and emasculating. Sovereign men don't do this. They say what needs to be said. They make the decisions they need to make. And then they allow her to feel however she feels about it. If she's upset, she's upset. If she needs space, she takes space. If she decides to leave, she leaves. But he doesn't contort himself to prevent her discomfort. Because he understands that attraction dies the moment a man becomes predictable through fear of female reaction. Begin to move as if you have options, even if you don't feel like you do. This is not about faking confidence or playing games. This is about reclaiming the psychological posture of a man who knows his value is not contingent on one person's approval. In practice, this means reinvesting in your life. It means returning to the gym, not to look better for her, but because training is a non-negotiable part of your structure. It means reconnecting with friends, pursuing projects, building skills, and creating a life that is genuinely compelling to you, independent of her presence. Most men stop doing this the moment they enter a relationship, and then they wonder why attraction fades. But the version of you she met, the version that had his own world, his own momentum, his own center of gravity, that's the version she was attracted to. The version that abandoned all of that to orbit around her is the version she loses respect for, so build it back. Not a strategy, not to make her jealous, but because that's who you actually are when you're not betraying yourself. Let me show you two futures. If you ignore this, if you continue to stay in situations that diminish you because you're afraid of being alone or starting over or admitting you were wrong, here's what happens. 5 years from now, you will be smaller. You'll have less energy, less confidence, less clarity about who you are and what you want. The relationships you'll attract will be worse because you'll be operating from even deeper scarcity. You'll have trained yourself to accept disrespect as normal, to swallow your needs as selfish, to view your own boundaries as inconveniences. You'll move through the world like a man who has internalized his own irrelevance. And the worst part is, you'll have done it to yourself, not because you weren't strong enough, but because you confused endurance with strength, because you believed the lie that staying was always better than leaving, because you were too afraid to act on what you already knew. But there's another path. If you take this as initiation, if you let this realization burn through the comfortable lies you've been telling yourself, here's what becomes possible. 5 years from now, you will have fewer people in your life, but the ones who remain will be there because they want to be, not because you're holding on too tight. you will have walked away from situations that didn't serve you. And in doing so, you will have reclaimed the part of yourself that knows what you're worth. You will have rebuilt your life around your mission, your standards, your non-negotiables. And from that position, the relationships you attract will be fundamentally different. Not perfect, not effortless, but reciprocal, built on respect rather than need. You will move through the world like a man who owns his decisions, who acts on clear information, who leaves when leaving is the right move, and stays when staying aligns with his values. This path is harder. It's lonelier at first. It requires you to sit with discomfort, to face the reality of markets and dynamics that don't favor you, to build yourself back up from a position of honesty rather than fantasy. But it's the only path that preserves your dignity. And dignity, in the end, is all you really have. Here's the truth compressed into one line. A man who stays too long in a situation that has stopped serving him is not being loyal. He's being complicit in his own erasure. Machiavelli understood that power is not given. It's taken by those clear-eyed enough to see when the terms have changed and disciplined enough to act accordingly. The man who waits for permission to protect himself will never receive it. The man who stays, hoping things will magically improve without his eye intervention, is writing his own tragedy. She does not owe you clarity. She does not owe you closure. She does not owe you a reason that makes sense. And you do not owe her your life. You owe yourself the basic respect of walking away when walking away is the only move that preserves your integrity. If this script hit something in you, if you felt the weight of recognition somewhere in your chest, then share it with the men who need to hear it. Subscribe to keep this work alive and circulating, because the only way we change the pattern is by speaking it clearly enough that men stop mistaking self-abandonment for love. The man who understands his own value never has to beg to be chosen.